Welcome. Before we begin our journey tonight, I invite you to take a moment just for yourself. Settle into your favorite position, adjust your pillow until it feels exactly right, and pull the blanket a little closer, creating a soft cocoon of warmth. Let the weight of your body sink into the mattress, feeling the steady, unmoving support of the ground beneath you. Tonight, we aren't just looking at the world around us. We are looking back through the immense, quiet stretches of time that made it. Imagine the earth not as a static place, but as a living, breathing storybook. We often think of history in terms of years or centuries. The lives of our grandparents, the age of ancient cities, or the rise and fall of empires. But the earth speaks in a different language. It speaks in millions and billions. This is what scientists call deep time. It is a scale so vast that a human life, or even the entirety of human civilization, is like a single fleeting blink in a long, sun-drenched afternoon. The ground beneath us is not just dirt and stone, it is a slow-moving archive. Every layer of soil, every jagged cliffside, and every deep-sea trench is a page in a story that has been being written for over 4.5 billion years. If you find the rhythm of these stories helps you drift into a restful state, I gently invite you to subscribe and join our community for more nightly explorations. And if you feel moved to do so, leaving a soft comment below is a lovely way to share this quiet space with others. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. Just listen. Just let the words wash over you like a slow tide. There is a profound peace in realizing that every rock has a memory. A smooth gray pebble you might pick up on a walk could have once been part of a towering volcano that touched the stratosphere. A piece of limestone in a garden wall might contain the tiny calcified shapes of creatures that swam in a warm, shallow ocean that vanished long before the first dinosaur was ever born. The earth remembers it all. It holds these secrets in layers of pressed silt and veins of cooling crystal, waiting for the slow passage of eons to reveal them to the light. To truly understand the world we wake up to every morning, we must leave the comfort of the present and travel back. We must go beyond the cities, beyond the forests, and even beyond the first spark of life itself. We are traveling back to a time when there was no blue sky, no green grass, and no birdsong. We are going back to the very beginning, to the moment the earth first hummed into existence, glowing softly in the velvet dark of the cosmos. Imagine the young Earth suspended in the velvet blackness of the early solar system. It does not look like the marble of blue and white we know today. Instead, it is a sphere of liquid fire, a molten world glowing with a deep inner warmth. At 4.5 billion years old, the Earth is in its infancy, a period geologists call the Hadean Eon. It is a time of immense heat, where the very rocks are fluid, churning and bubbling like a slow-moving sea of orange light. There is no solid ground to stand on yet, only the radiant energy of a planet finding its form in the cold silence of space. In this ancient darkness, the Earth was not alone. Scientists believe that during these first formative millions of years, a celestial body the size of Mars, often called Theia, crossed paths with our young planet. It was a monumental encounter, a collision that reshaped the destiny of both worlds. From the debris of this immense impact, a ring of red-hot rock and dust began to orbit the Earth, eventually pulling itself together through the quiet persistence of gravity to form our moon. In those early nights, the moon would have appeared much larger and closer in the sky than it does now, a glowing, cooling companion born from the Earth's own substance, watching over the world below as it began its long transition. As the millions of years drifted by, the intense heat of the Earth's formation began to radiate away into the vacuum. The surface, once a restless ocean of magma, started to slow its churning. A thin, dark crust began to form, much like the way a delicate layer of ice settles over a pond in the winter, or the way a skin forms on a cooling surface. These were the first patches of solid ground, islands of basalt and hardened stone floating on a sea of fire. The chaos of the beginning was starting to find a sense of order. The planet was exhaling, releasing vast amounts of steam and gas from its interior through volcanic vents, creating a thick, heavy blanket of an atmosphere that wrapped around the globe like a protective shroud. The sky during this time was not blue, but a heavy dark gray, thick with water vapor and carbon dioxide. As the crust continued to harden and the temperature dropped just enough, a profound change occurred. The steam in the atmosphere began to condense. The first clouds formed, massive, towering pillars of gray that blotted out the young sun. And then, for the first time in the history of our world, it began to rain. It was not a gentle spring shower, but a relentless, cooling deluge that would last for thousands, perhaps millions of years. The sound of that first rain hitting the hot, dark rocks must have been a constant, rhythmic hiss, a song of cooling and creation that echoed across the empty world. As the water pooled in the low-lying basins of the crust, the very first whispers of the oceans began to take shape, turning the fiery world into a realm of water and stone. As the centuries turn into millennia, that relentless rain begins to transform the face of the earth. Imagine the sound of it, a constant rhythmic drumming against the cooling crust. In the low-lying basins and deep valleys carved by volcanic heat, the water begins to gather. At first, it might have been just scattered ponds and shallow lakes, but as the cooling continues, these waters swell and merge, creeping across the dark rocky plains until they form the very first oceans. These were not the bright turquoise seas we see today. Under a heavy, hazy atmosphere, thick with carbon dioxide and methane, the water would have appeared dark and vast, a still brooding mirror reflecting a sky that was likely a soft, dusty orange or a deep, somber gray. There is a quiet mystery in these ancient waters, one that geologists have spent lifetimes trying to solve. How did all this water get here? While much of it was exhaled from the Earth's own interior in the form of steam, many scientists believe that our oceans were also a gift from the far reaches of the solar system. During a period of intense activity, icy comets and water-rich asteroids may have rained down upon the young planet, delivering their frozen cargo to the surface. It is a humbling thought to consider as you drift toward sleep, that the water in our tea, our clouds, and our very cells might have once drifted through the cold silence of interstellar space, carried here on the backs of ancient travelers. We know these oceans existed so early in our history because of tiny, resilient witnesses called zircon crystals. These microscopic minerals are the oldest known materials on Earth, some dating back nearly 4.4 billion years. They are like Ben's indestructible time capsules. Within their crystalline structure, they hold chemical signatures that prove they formed in the presence of liquid water. Even as the rest of the Earth's early crust was melted and recycled by the planet's internal heat, these little zircons remained, holding on to the memory of those first cool shores. The world was quiet then. No birds, no trees, no wind through the grass. There was only the sound of waves lapping against volcanic rock and the distant rumble of a planet still settling into its skin. But within these warm, mineral-rich waters, something extraordinary was beginning to happen. The oceans were becoming a vast global laboratory. Elements were swirling together, reacting in the heat of hydrothermal vents on the seafloor, creating increasingly complex molecules. The stage was being set. The chemistry of the world was slowly, patiently turning into the biology of the world. In the stillness of these ancient shallows, the very first chemical whispers of life were starting to stir, preparing to build something that would change the planet forever. These tiny, invisible reactions were the quiet precursors to a world that would soon begin to breathe. Imagine standing on the edge of a shoreline 3.5 billion years ago. The air is still thick and heavy, and there is no green to be seen on the land behind you. But in the warm, sunlit shallows of the sea, something remarkable is taking shape. If you look down through the clear, shallow water, you see strange, rounded mounds rising from the sandy floor. They look like lumpy gray stones, or perhaps giant mushrooms made of sediment and mineral. These are stromatolites, and they are the oldest fossils on Earth, the very first tangible evidence of life's enduring presence. These mounds were not built by hands or even by complex animals. They were built layer by microscopic layer by colonies of tiny organisms called cyanobacteria. These bacteria were the world's first great architects. As they lived in the sun-drenched water, they secreted a sticky film that trapped tiny grains of sand and drifting minerals. Over hundreds, then thousands, then millions of years, these layers stacked upon one another, slowly turning into stone. It is a process that requires immense patience, a slow, rhythmic building that reflects the unhurried pace of the young Earth. If you were to watch them in the quiet of that ancient afternoon, you might see nothing happen for centuries. But if you looked very closely at the surface of these living rocks, you would see something beautiful. Tiny silver bubbles of gas would be clinging to the surface of the mounds, eventually breaking free and floating softly toward the surface, like pearls rising through the water. These bubbles were oxygen. For the first time in history, life was using the light of the sun to create energy through photosynthesis, and in doing so, it was releasing oxygen as a byproduct. This was a revolutionary moment, though it happened with the gentlest of whispers. Before these tiny microbes began their work, the Earth's atmosphere was almost entirely devoid of the gas we need to breathe. But as the stromatolites grew, they began to exhale. It was a slow, steady breath that would continue for billions of years. One by one, these tiny bubbles joined the vast ocean of air above. At first, the oxygen was absorbed by the minerals in the water and the rocks on the seafloor, turning the oceans a deep, rusty red as the iron within them began to oxidize. But eventually, the Earth could hold no more. The oxygen began to spill out of the water and into the sky. These humble mounds, which you can still find today in rare, quiet corners of the world like Shark Bay in Australia, were the engines of a global transformation. They were the quiet pioneers that began to change the very chemistry of our planet. As the oxygen levels slowly rose, the thick orange haze of the early atmosphere began to thin and clear, making way for a new kind of world. The ancient silent world was beginning to awaken, stirred by the patient, rhythmic work of its smallest inhabitants. And while these microbes worked in the shallows, the very foundation they rested upon was also beginning to stir, preparing for a journey of its own across the surface of the globe. While those tiny microbes were busy breathing life into the atmosphere, the very ground they rested on was beginning a journey of its own. It is easy to think of the Earth's surface as a permanent, solid shell, as fixed and unchanging as the floor beneath your bed. But in reality, the ground we walk upon is more like a vast, slow-moving jigsaw puzzle. Each piece of this puzzle is a tectonic plate, and these plates are constantly shifting, sliding, and drifting over the surface of our world. Deep beneath the cooling crust where the stromatolites grew, there is a heart of fire. The Earth's core is a sphere of intense heat, a remnant of the planet's violent birth and the slow decay of ancient elements. This heat creates a gentle but powerful engine. It warms the mantle, the thick layer of rock that sits between the core and the crust. This mantle is a strange and beautiful thing. It is not a liquid ocean of magma, yet it is not quite solid rock either. It is what scientists call semi-solid, moving with the heavy, patient consistency of warm wax or thick honey. As the heat from the core rises, it creates slow rolling currents within the mantle. These currents act like a silent conveyor belt, carrying the massive plates of the crust along with them on a journey that lasts for billions of years. It is a movement so gradual that it is impossible to see with the naked eye. If you were to stand on the edge of a continent and watch the horizon for 1,000 years, the view would seem exactly the same. To understand the pace of our planet, you only need to look at your own hands. Tectonic plates move at roughly the same speed that your fingernails grow, just a few centimeters every year. It is a pace that matches the patient, unhurried rhythm of the universe, a reminder that the most profound changes often happen in the smallest, most quiet increments. And so, the continents began their first slow dance across the globe. Land masses that were once scattered and far apart began to drift toward one another, sliding over the hidden currents of the mantle. They were drawn together by the deep forces of the Earth's interior, closing the distances between them over hundreds of millions of years. When these plates eventually met, they did so with a force that, over eons, would push up the first great mountain ranges and carve out the deep, dark basins of the sea. This constant, restless movement meant that the map of the world was never finished. It was always being redrawn by the heat of the core. Slowly, the scattered islands of land began to cluster together, drawn by the currents below into a single, massive embrace. This gathering of land was the beginning of a grand cycle, leading toward the formation of the first great supercontinent, a giant landmass that would sit quietly under a changing sky, waiting for the atmosphere above to catch up with the transformations happening below. As the land masses began their slow migration across the surface, a silent revolution was unfolding in the air above. For millions of years, the sky had not been the familiar, deep blue we know today. In those early eons, the atmosphere was thick with methane and carbon dioxide, casting a soft, hazy orange glow over the cooling rocks and the iron-rich seas. It was a world of permanent sunset hues even at midday, where the sun appeared as a pale disk behind a veil of ancient gases. But deep in the shallow waters, the stromatolites and their microscopic architects were working tirelessly. They were breathing out oxygen, one tiny bubble at a time, year after year, for centuries uncounted. For a very long time, this oxygen stayed trapped in the oceans, reacting with the dissolved iron and settling onto the seafloor in beautiful rusty layers of red rock. But eventually, the oceans could hold no more. The iron was spent, the chemical sinks were full, and the oxygen began to rise, escaping the waves and spilling into the sky. This moment, occurring roughly 2.4 billion years ago, is known as the Great Oxidation Event. It was the moment the Earth truly began to breathe. It was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, steady transformation that reshaped the chemistry of the entire world. As oxygen flooded the atmosphere, it reacted with the methane, clearing the orange haze that had defined the planet for so long. Slowly, the sky began to transition, cooling and clarifying into a soft, pale blue, the color of a quiet, clear morning. High above the clouds, a new layer was forming, silent and invisible. The sun's energy was interacting with this newfound oxygen, knitting the molecules together to create the ozone layer. This was a turning point of immense importance. Before this shield existed, the sun's harsh ultraviolet rays beat down on the surface with a force that made life on land nearly impossible. But with the ozone layer in place, the Earth became a protected cradle. This invisible blanket began to filter the sun's intensity, creating a sanctuary where life could finally begin to dream of complexity. It was no longer just a struggle for survival in the deep, dark cracks of the ocean floor. The entire planet was being prepared for something more. This oxygen didn't just change the color of the sky. It provided the high-energy fuel that would eventually allow for the rise of complex, multi-celled organisms. It was the spark that would one day lead to everything that walks, crawls, or flies. As the air became clearer and the protective shield settled into place, the world felt a new kind of stability. The chaotic, violent beginnings of the planet were fading into a long, calm era of growth. Down below, the tectonic plates continued their patient work, guided by the heat of the core. With a stable atmosphere overhead and a shield against the stars, the drifting land masses began to find one another, clustering together in the vast blue oceans. They were moving toward a grand convergence, seeking the center of the world to form a giant, singular mass that would dominate the map for millions of years to come. As the drifting continents continued their slow-motion journey across the face of the globe, they began to huddle together, drawn by the invisible forces of the mantle. Slowly, over millions of years, they merged into a single, massive landmass that would dominate the planet for ages. This was the first great supercontinent we truly understand, a world that existed long before the first dinosaur ever walked the earth, and even before the first fish swam in the seas. We call this ancient land Rodinia. The name Rodinia comes from a word meaning to give birth, and in many ways it was the mother of all future continents. Imagine, if you will, looking down at the Earth from the quiet of space 1 billion years ago. Instead of the scattered green and brown patches we see today, you would see one giant rugged island sitting almost entirely in the southern hemisphere, surrounded by a single vast and endless blue ocean known as Marovia. Rodinia was a place of immense scale and profound quietude. Because this was 1 billion years ago, the land was entirely different from the world we know. There were no forests to rustle in the breeze, no grasslands to sway, and no insects to buzz in the heat of the afternoon. The land was a stark, beautiful expanse of bare rock, gray mountains, and sweeping plains of sand and dust. It was a world of browns, reds, and grays, stretching out toward every horizon under that soft, pale blue sky. The center of this supercontinent was so vast and so far from the moisture of the sea that it was a silent, eternal desert. Rain rarely reached the deep interior. In the heart of Rodinia, the only sound would have been the soft whistle of the wind as it moved across the jagged peaks of mountain ranges that have long since eroded into dust. There were no birds to call out, no animals to scurry underfoot. It was a landscape of pure, unblemished stillness, a place where time seemed to hold its breath for millions of years.
Life, at this time, was still a secret kept by the oceans.
While the land remained a silent wasteland, the coastal waters of Marovia were teeming with microscopic life. Tiny cells and simple colonies of algae basking in the sunlit shallows, continuing the work of oxygenating the world. They were the only witnesses to the slow, heavy movement of the world. But even a giant like Rodinia could not stay whole forever. Deep beneath the crust, the Earth's inner heat was building up, trapped like a heavy blanket under the massive continent. The heat began to push upward, stretching the land and creating great cracks in the surface. Slowly, the supercontinent began to rift and tear. Huge blocks of land started to drift away from one another, opening up new seaways and changing the flow of the ocean's currents. This breakup was more than just a change in geography. It was the beginning of a dramatic shift in the global climate. As the land split apart, more coastline was created, and the way the earth absorbed and reflected the sun's warmth began to change. The long, warm silence of Rodinia was coming to an end, and the planet was about to enter one of its most mysterious and challenging eras, a time when the blue world would turn almost entirely white. Imagine the world beginning to grow quiet and cold, not just the chill of a winter evening, but a deep global hush that lasted for millions of years. As the supercontinent of Rodinia continued to break apart, the very chemistry of the air began to change. The warmth that had hugged the planet for so long started to slip away, escaping back into the cold void of space. This era is known to scientists as Snowball Earth, a time when our blue planet transformed into a shimmering white marble, frozen almost entirely from pole to pole. Take a slow, deep breath and imagine standing on the surface of this ancient world. Everywhere you look, there is nothing but a vast, blinding expanse of white. The great oceans, once restless and surging, are now silent, capped by a layer of ice that some believe was over a kilometer thick. The wind sweeps across this endless, frozen desert, carrying no scent of life, only the fine, crystalline dust of dry snow. This was a world of extreme reflection. Because the ice was so white and so vast, it acted like a giant mirror, bouncing the sun's gentle warmth back into space before it could ever touch the ground. This created a cycle of cooling that seemed impossible to break. The more the ice grew, the colder the planet became, until even the tropical waters at the equator were locked in a heavy, frozen embrace. It was a time of profound stillness, a long, deep sleep for the Earth. Yet, even in this planetary deep freeze, the spark of life did not go out. Far beneath the crushing weight of the ice, in the pitch-black depths of the frozen oceans, life found a way to endure. Imagine the seafloor, miles below the frozen surface, where the Earth's inner heat still pulsed. Here, volcanic vents known as black smokers billowed out clouds of warm, mineral-rich water. In these small, glowing pockets of warmth, tiny microbes and simple organisms huddled together. They didn't need the sun. They lived off the chemical energy of the Earth itself. While the surface was a graveyard of ice, the deep sea remained a warm, dark sanctuary, a quiet cradle where life waited patiently for the world to wake up. For millions of years, the planet remained in this frozen state, but beneath the ice, the Earth was still active. Volcanoes continued to rumble, slowly leaking carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Because the world was covered in ice, there were no plants to breathe in the gas and no rain to wash it away. Very slowly, like a blanket being pulled over a sleeper, the carbon dioxide built up, trapping the sun's heat once again. Eventually, the ice began to groan and crack. The great thaw had begun. As the glaciers retreated, they ground down the rocks beneath them, releasing a massive surge of nutrients and minerals into the warming oceans. The world was waking up, and the water was now a rich, fertile soup ready for something new. The long white silence was over, and as the sunlight finally reached the waves again, it triggered a sudden, magnificent burst of biological creativity that would change the face of the Earth forever. As the great thaw continued, the world entered a strange and beautiful chapter known as the Ediacaran period. Imagine the Earth about 600 million years ago. The air is still quiet, and the land remains a barren expanse of rock and dust. But beneath the surface of the warming oceans, a silent revolution is taking place. For billions of years, life was microscopic, invisible to the naked eye. But now, in the nutrient-rich waters left behind by the retreating glaciers, life is finally beginning to dream in larger shapes. If you were to drift down through the clear, shallow waters of this ancient sea, you wouldn't see fish or coral reefs. Instead, the seafloor is covered in a soft, living carpet. These are the Ediacaran biota, the first large, complex, multicellular organisms to ever exist. They are unlike anything alive to today. They look less like animals and more like delicate quilted cushions or ornate ribbed leaves made of flesh. Take a slow, deep breath and imagine one of these creatures resting on the sandy bottom. This is Dickinsonia. It is one of the most famous inhabitants of this lost world. To look at it is to see a masterpiece of simple geometry. It is oval-shaped, flat as a pancake, and divided into many small segments that fan out from a central line, much like the veins of a leaf or the pattern of a thumbprint. Some of these creatures are only a few centimeters long, while others grow to be nearly 4 feet across, lying still and heavy in the gentle current. There is a profound stillness to this era. These creatures have no eyes to see you, no ears to hear the water moving, and perhaps most strangely, they have no mouths. They do not hunt, and they do not eat in the way we understand. They simply exist in a state of perfect, quiet harmony with their environment. Scientists believe these soft-bodied wonders live by absorbing nutrients directly from the seawater through their skin, or perhaps by soaking up the energy from the thick mats of bacteria that coated the seafloor. They were like living sponges, soaking up the world around them without ever needing to move a muscle. This was the Garden of Ediacara, a period of Earth's history that felt like a long, peaceful afternoon. There were no predators yet. No creature had developed teeth to bite, or claws to scratch, or shells to hide within. It was a world of soft edges and slow rhythms, where life swayed back and forth with the tides, undisturbed and safe. As you settle deeper into your own rest, imagine the gentle pulse of that ancient ocean. The water is warm, the light from the sun is filtered and soft, and the seafloor is a gallery of these strange, quilted forms, glowing faintly in the dimness. It was a time of biological experimentation, a moment where nature was testing out what it meant to be large, to be complex, and to be alive. But this quiet garden was not meant to last forever. Underneath the surface of this tranquility, the chemistry of the ocean was changing once again. The simple, stationary life of the Ediacaran was about to face a new kind of energy. The soft, quilted forms that had ruled the world for millions of years were soon to be challenged by a sudden, frantic burst of evolution. The world was about to move faster, grow harder, and develop the very first tools for survival. The age of the soft and the still was drawing to a close, making way for the most famous growth spurt in the history of our planet. Imagine the scene as the soft, quilted world of the Ediacaran begins to fade, like a dream giving way to the morning light. We are entering the Cambrian period, a time of such incredible biological creativity that it is often called the Cambrian explosion. But don't let the word explosion startle you. In the vast, slow timeline of the Earth, this was simply a moment where life decided to try everything at once, a sudden, magnificent growth spurt that would change the face of the planet forever. After billions of years of simple cells and millions of years of stationary soft forms, the ocean was about to wake up. As you breathe in slowly, imagine the seafloor transforming. The silence of the ancient garden is replaced by a new kind of energy. Evolution in this era began to invent the tools of the modern world. For the first time, creatures began to grow hard parts. They pulled minerals from the seawater to build shells for protection and sturdy internal skeletons for support. These weren't just random changes. They were the blueprints for almost every animal group we know today. The most transformative invention of all, however, was the gift of sight. For nearly 4 billion years, the world had been perceived only through touch, chemical signals, or the vague warmth of the sun. But in the Cambrian, the first eyes appeared. Imagine being a creature in that ancient sea and for the very first time seeing the ripple of the waves above or the shape of a neighbor nearby. The most iconic residents of this new world were the trilobites. These remarkable creatures looked a bit like armored woodlice, scuttling across the sandy bottom. Their eyes were unlike anything we have today. They were made of tiny, clear crystals of calcite. Imagine looking through a lens of pure stone, a gemstone eye that never grew cloudy and never needed to focus like ours do. With these crystal eyes, the trilobites watched as the world around them became a bustling, complex theater of life. With sight and speed came the first predators. The peaceful afternoon of the Ediacaran had ended, replaced by a sophisticated game of hide and seek. Life became a dance of strategy. Some animals grew long spines to stay safe, while others developed powerful limbs to move faster. The ocean floor was no longer a static gallery. It was a diverse and busy ecosystem, filled with the clicking of shells, the scurrying of many-legged wanderers, and the soft clouds of silt kicked up by creatures exploring their new reality. It was a world of hard-shelled wonders and strange experimental forms that seem almost alien to us now. The sheer variety of life during this time was staggering, a kaleidoscope of biological possibilities. And while much of this history could have been lost to the crushing weight of time, a few special places on Earth acted as a perfect memory. One particular spot, high in the mountains of what is now Canada, would one day reveal the most delicate details of this ancient explosion, capturing even the softest whispers of the creatures that lived and breathed in that distant, sun-drenched sea. Close your eyes and imagine a high, windy ridge in the Canadian Rockies. The air is thin and cold here, and the jagged peaks are often dusted with a layer of silent, white snow. This place is known as the Burgess Shale. It is hard to believe, but 500 million years ago, this very spot was located at the bottom of a deep, warm tropical ocean. Because of a rare and lucky accident of geology, the creatures that lived in those ancient waters weren't just turned into stone. They were captured in exquisite, ghostly detail. Usually, time is a hungry thief. It eats away at everything soft, skin, muscles, eyes, and delicate organs, leaving behind only the hard shells and bones. But in the Burgess Shale, fine silken mud swept over the seafloor in sudden underwater avalanches. It buried the creatures so quickly and so completely that it locked out oxygen and decay, preserving even their softest whispers. When researchers first began to split these layers of shale open in 1909, they discovered a world that looked like something out of a beautiful, surreal dream. Take a slow, deep breath and picture one of these residents, a creature called Opabinia. It was only a few inches long, but it possessed 5 eyes perched on stalks, staring out in every direction to watch for movement in the water. It had a long, flexible nozzle ending in a pincer, which it used to delicately pick up bits of food from the sandy floor. Its shape was so strange that when its reconstruction was first shown to other scientists, they reportedly laughed, thinking it was a clever prank. But Opabinia was very real, a testament to how wildly creative life was in its youth. Then there was Hallucigenia. Its name alone tells you how surreal it appeared to the people who first studied it. For many years, scientists were so confused by its body that they accidentally reconstructed it upside down. They originally thought it walked on stiff, stilt-like spines and had a row of waving tentacles along its back. Only much later did they realize the spines were for protection on top, and the tentacles were actually its soft, clawed legs. It was a tiny walking pincushion, navigating a world where the rules of anatomy were still being written. In this ancient sea, nature was experimenting with every possible design. Some of these forms became the ancestors of almost everything we see today, while others were evolutionary dead ends. Beautiful, strange ideas that didn't quite make it into the long-term future. It was a time of boundless biological curiosity, a laboratory of life where the blueprints for the world were being drafted in the soft silt of the ocean floor. But as busy and diverse as the oceans had become, the world above the waves remained a very different place. If you were to stand on a prehistoric beach during this time, you would hear only the lonely sound of the wind and the rhythmic, heavy crashing of the tide. There were no birds in the sky, no insects buzzing in the air, and no green leaves rustling in the breeze. The land was a vast, silent expanse of gray rock and dark sand waiting for its turn to join the story. The stage was set, and soon the very first pioneers would begin their slow, courageous journey out of the water and onto the shore. For millions of years, the land had been a silent witness to the bustling life beneath the waves. While the oceans were teeming with trilobites and strange five-eyed creatures, the continents remained still. Vast, empty stretches of sun-baked rock and dark volcanic sand. But change was coming, drifting in with the spray of the saltwater tides. Imagine a quiet, rocky shoreline where the waves gently lap against the shore. In the damp crevices where the water reaches but doesn't quite stay, a new kind of life is beginning to experiment with the air. These were the first brave pioneers, tiny, microscopic specks of green algae that found a way to survive just outside the water's edge. They didn't have leaves or stems yet. They were more like a soft, living carpet, clinging to the wet surfaces of the stones. In these early days, these pioneers didn't travel alone. They worked in a quiet partnership with fungi, which had also begun to creep onto the land. Together, they formed a resilient team. The fungi reached into the cracks of the hard rock, breaking down minerals to create the very first hints of soil, while the green algae captured the sunlight, turning it into energy. It was a slow, patient process, unfolding over spans of time that are difficult for us to even imagine. As you settle deeper into your pillow, take a slow, rhythmic breath and picture this transformation. About 470 million years ago, the first true land plants began to appear. They were likely very similar to the liverworts we see today in damp, shady corners of the world. Small, flat, ribbon-like plants that hug the ground. They didn't have roots to dig deep into the earth, nor did they have the strength to stand tall. Instead, they stayed close to the moisture, soaking up water like tiny sponges and anchoring themselves with delicate, hair-like threads called rhizoids. Bit by bit, the landscape began to change. The harsh metallic grays and deep blacks of the ancient rocks were slowly being draped in a soft, mossy green. This wasn't a sudden burst of color, but a gradual, peaceful spreading. It was the first time the earth had ever worn a coat of green. This thin layer of life began to soften the edges of the world, dampening the sound of the wind and holding on to the moisture from the rain. While these tiny plants were quietly claiming the shorelines, the world itself was in a state of slow, majestic motion. The great land masses were drifting, driven by the heat deep within the Earth's core. The supercontinent of Gondwana was shifting toward the South Pole, and the oceans between the continents were closing and opening like a slow-motion breath. The map of the world was being redrawn, even as the first green shadows began to stretch across the land, preparing the way for a world that would soon grow much taller and more complex. As the Silurian period dawns, roughly 430 million years ago, a quiet but profound revolution begins to unfold across the landscape. The soft, mossy carpets that first ventured onto the shore are no longer alone. Nature has begun to experiment with a new kind of biological architecture, developing what we might think of as the Earth's first plumbing. This was the birth of vascular plants, a lineage of life that figured out how to move water against the pull of gravity. Imagine the world at this time. The air is still and humid, and the silence is broken only by the sound of water trickling over stone. Until now, plants were like soft blankets, never straying far from the moisture of the water's edge because they had no way to transport fluids through their bodies. But now they have developed internal tubes, tiny, reinforced channels that act like straws, pulling water from the damp earth and carrying it upward into their tissues. This simple change was a monumental leap in the story of our planet. It meant that a plant no longer had to lay flat against a wet rock to survive. For the first time, life could stand up. It could reach toward the sun, claiming a piece of the sky. Picture a tiny plant called Cooksonia, one of the very first to master this upright posture. If you were to see it today, you might not even notice it at first. It was humble and small, usually only a few centimeters tall, no bigger than a person's thumb. It didn't have leaves or flowers yet, just simple, smooth green stems that branched out into elegant Y shapes, with each tip holding a small, round capsule for its spores. Though it was small, Cooksonia was a pioneer of height and complexity. By standing upright, it began to add a new dimension to the world. The landscape was no longer just a flat map of greens and grays. It was becoming a three-dimensional space. As these early vascular plants began to cluster together along the riverbanks and coastlines, they created the very first miniature forests. To our eyes, they would have looked like a field of tiny green matchsticks or delicate pipe cleaners. But to the earth, they were a transformation. This new vertical world created something the land had never truly experienced before: shade. Beneath these tiny canopies, the ground stayed cooler and moister for longer periods. The air between the stems became a protected space, a tiny sanctuary shielded from the wind and the direct heat of the sun. As these plants lived and died, their remains began to build up thicker, richer layers of soil, creating a foundation for even more life to take root. With this new source of food and shelter firmly established on the shorelines, the invitation was out. The land was no longer a barren, rocky desert. It was a garden, however small and strange it might seem. And soon, the first silent observers from the sea began to follow. Tiny creatures, the ancient ancestors of today's millipedes and spiders, found that they could creep out of the tides and into the safety of the green stems. They found a new home in a world that was growing more complex with every passing million years. As the pulse of life moved deeper into the heart of the continents, preparing the way for even larger travelers to follow in their footsteps. While those first tiny forests were quietly claiming the shorelines, the oceans were undergoing a revolution of their own. We have arrived at a chapter of Earth's history known as the Devonian period, a time so defined by the success of aquatic life that scientists often call it the Age of Fishes. If you could look beneath the surface of these ancient seas, you would see a world of movement and color, far more diverse and complex than anything that had come before. In the deep open waters, the rulers of the sea were the plecoderms, strange, majestic creatures covered in heavy suits of bony armor. The most famous of these was Dunkleosteus. Imagine a fish the size of a modern bus, its head and chest encased in thick, protective plates that might have shimmered like polished stone in the dim light of the depths. What made Dunkleosteus truly unique was its mouth. It didn't have teeth made of enamel like ours. Instead, its jawbones had evolved into massive, self-sharpening plates of bone. When it closed its mouth, these plates acted like powerful shears, clicking together with incredible force. Despite their size and strength, these armored giants moved with a slow, rhythmic grace, their heavy bodies gliding through the currents as they patrolled their silent, watery kingdoms. But while these giants held sway in the deep, a different kind of magic was happening in the shallows. Close your eyes and imagine a sun-drenched lagoon where the water is warm and still. Here, the first riverside plants we spoke of, the mosses and the small upright stems, are reflected in the glassy surface of the water. In these shallow pools, the water was often low in oxygen, especially during the heat of the day when the sun beat down on the mud. To survive in these stagnant corners of the world, some fish began to adapt in a way that would change the course of history forever. They began to develop the ability to breathe air. It started simply with small vascular sacs in their throats that could gulp in a bubble of atmosphere from the surface, allowing them to extract oxygen when the water around them was too thin to support them through gills alone. Over millions of years, these sacs became more efficient, turning into primitive lungs. At the same time, their fins were changing too. Instead of the delicate fan-like rays found on most fish, a specific group known as lobe-finned fish began to develop sturdy, fleshy bases for their fins. Inside these fins were bones, the very same bones that would one day, over vast stretches of time, become the humerus, the radius, and the ulna of a human arm. These fish weren't just swimming, they were starting to lean. They could prop themselves up in the mud of a drying pool or pull themselves through the tangled roots of a swamp. This was the moment the bridge between the water and the air was finally crossed. It wasn't a sudden leap, but a slow, cautious transition. A series of tiny, successful experiments by nature to see if life could find a way to exist in the space between two worlds. As the sun sets on the Devonian landscape, casting long golden shadows across the quiet estuaries, we find ourselves standing on the threshold of a new era. The water is no longer a boundary, but a starting point. And hidden among the reeds of a shallow stream, a very specific creature is about to show us just how far a fish can go when it decides to take its first heavy step onto the land. This creature, a perfect blend of two worlds, waits in the silt. its strong fins ready to push against the earth. Imagine, if you will, a creature resting in the shallows of a quiet prehistoric stream. This is Tiktaalik, often called the fishapod, a name that hints at its remarkable place in history, caught right in the middle between a fish and a four-legged animal. If you were to see it resting there, you might feel a strange sense of recognition, for although it lived 375 million years ago, it carried within its body the architectural plans for almost every land animal that would follow. From a distance, Tiktaalik might look like a sturdy, flattened fish, perhaps a bit like a modern-day gar or a crocodile. It was covered in scales and possessed gills, and it likely spent most of its life submerged in the cool, slow-moving waters of ancient river deltas. But as we look closer, through the lens of deep time, we see features that no ordinary fish of its era possessed. Most fish have heads that are fused directly to their shoulders, meaning they have to move their entire bodies to look left or right. But Tiktaalik had a neck. It could move its head independently of its torso, a simple but profound grace that allowed it to look around its environment in a way its ancestors never could. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing about Tiktaalik was its strength. Take a slow breath and imagine the effort of a creature trying to lift itself. Within its front fins, Tiktaalik had functional wrists and elbows. While other fish used their fins to steer through the water, Tiktaalik could use its fins to support its own weight. It could literally do a push-up, lifting its head and chest out of the shallow water to breathe the air, or perhaps to peer across the muddy banks at the mossy world waiting for it. Inside those fins, hidden beneath the scales, was the blueprint for every limb that would ever walk, climb, or fly on Earth. Its bone structure matches our own in a way that feels like a quiet, ancient secret. It had a single large bone at the top, followed by two smaller bones, and then a series of smaller bones that formed a primitive wrist. This is the same humerus, radius, and ulna that allow you to reach out and touch the world today. When we look at the fossils of Tiktaalik, we aren't just looking at a curious relic found in the rocks of the Canadian Arctic. We are looking at a distant, ancient relative. From the smallest frog to the tallest giraffe, and eventually Gule to us, the journey onto land began with these small, determined movements in the mud. The success of these first pioneers, these brave explorers of the damp earth, opened the door to a transformation of the entire planet. As life fully committed to the land, the continents began to turn into a lush, emerald paradise. The oxygen levels in the atmosphere began to rise to heights we can hardly imagine today, fueling a world of unprecedented growth and strange, oversized wonders. The quiet, muddy streams of the Devonian were giving way to the towering, humid forests of the Carboniferous, a time when the earth itself seemed to pulse with a new, vibrant energy. Imagine stepping into a world where the very air feels different, thick, sweet, and heavy with life. This is the Carboniferous period, a time roughly 300 million years ago when the earth was draped in a blanket of deep, humid green. The name Carboniferous means coal-bearing. And as we linger here in the stillness of these ancient woods, we begin to see why. The forests of this era are unlike any we know today. There are no flowers yet, no colorful petals or sweet perfumes. Instead, there is a symphony of greens, towering ferns, some as tall as 5-story buildings, reach toward the sun, their delicate fronds casting long, soft shadows over the damp ground. Giant club mosses and horsetails, cousins of the small plants we see in marshlands today, grow to the size of mighty oaks, their trunks patterned like the scales of a fish. Take a slow, deep breath and imagine the oxygen filling your lungs. In this distant age, the atmosphere was saturated with oxygen, reaching levels nearly twice as high as what we breathe today. This chemical abundance acted like a fuel for the world, allowing life to experiment with scale in ways that seem almost magical. If you were to look up through the canopy of the giant ferns, you might see a flash of iridescent blue or gold. This is Meganura, a dragonfly the size of a hawk, with a wingspan of 70 centimeters, nearly 2.5 feet. It glides through the thick air with a soft, low hum. Because insects breathe through tiny tubes in their bodies, the high oxygen levels allowed them to grow far larger than they ever could in our modern world. In this heavy atmosphere, flight was easier, and these magnificent creatures soared through the humid air as the undisputed masters of the ski. On the forest floor, the rhythm of life continues in the shadows, moving slowly through the layers of fallen leaves, and soft moss is Arthropleura, a distant relative of the modern millipede. But while today's millipedes are small enough to curl up in the palm of your hand, Arthropleura was a giant, stretching over 2 meters long. Imagine the gentle, undulating sound of its many legs, moving over the damp earth, a slow, steady heartbeat of a creature perfectly at home in its oversized world. It was not a predator, but a peaceful browser, grazing on the fallen vegetation of the forest floor. It is a landscape of immense quiet and overwhelming growth. The air is so dense and rich that it supports these giants with ease, creating a humid emerald cradle where life is vibrant and unhurried. The world feels saturated, a place where every inch of the land is covered in a thick, wet carpet of vegetation, growing and dying in a continuous cycle of abundance. But as these massive forests flourished, they were also quietly preparing a legacy that would change the world millions of years later. The trees of the Carboniferous did not simply rot away when they fell. Instead, they began to pile up layer upon layer in the vast, stagnant swamps. As we watch the mist settle over the green horizon, we are witnessing the beginning of a process that would lock the sun's energy deep within the earth, waiting in the silence for an era yet to come. As those massive, scale-barked trees finally reached the end of their long lives, they did something unusual. In our world today, when a tree falls, it is slowly reclaimed by the earth. Fungi and bacteria go to work, breaking down the wood and returning its nutrients to the soil. But in the humid silence of the Carboniferous, nature was still learning how to recycle. These trees had developed a new, incredibly tough material called lignin, the sturdy glue that allowed them to grow so tall and strong. But the fungi and microbes of that era hadn't yet evolved the biological tools to break lignin down. So, as the trees fell into the shallow, stagnant swamp waters, they didn't rot away. Instead, They simply lay there, submerged in the low oxygen depths, protected from the usual process of decay. Over thousands and then millions of years, these trunks piled up, one on top of the other, forming thick, heavy layers of organic matter. Imagine a blanket of fallen giants stretching for miles in every direction, slowly being covered by silt and mud as the ancient rivers shifted their paths. Take a slow, quiet breath in, feeling the stillness of that ancient burial ground. The weight of the world above began to press down on these buried forests. As more and more sediment accumulated, the pressure intensified, and the heat from deep within the earth began to bake the ancient wood. Slowly, ever so slowly, the water was squeezed out, and the chemical structure of the plants began to change. What was once a green, living canopy was transformed into peat, then into soft brown coal, and finally into the hard black seams of energy that we find deep underground today. In a very literal sense, the earth was taking a long, deep breath. By burying these forests, the planet was inhaling vast amounts of carbon from the atmosphere and locking it away in the dark. This is why the oxygen levels rose so high during this time. The carbon was no longer in the air to balance it out. The Earth was cleaning its own skis, storing the sun's ancient energy in a crystalline, silent form that would wait for hundreds of millions of years to be found. But this great carbon storage project had a profound effect on the world's climate. As the carbon dioxide, a gas that helps trap heat, was pulled from the air and buried, the planet began to cool. The humid tropical heat of the coal swamps started to fade. The air grew thinner and crisper. The vast wet forest that had dominated the landscape for so long began to retreat, leaving behind a world that was becoming drier and more seasonal. The emerald cradle of the Carboniferous was slowly changing into something new. The wide, shallow seas and endless swamps were giving way to vast plains and rugged interiors. As the moisture left the air, the life that remained had to find new ways to survive in a world where water was no longer everywhere. The stage was being set for a different kind of resilience, where the creatures of the land would finally find a way to break their last ties to the water's edge. As the lush, humid world of the Carboniferous began to dry out, a new era dawned, the Permian period. The air, once heavy with the scent of damp moss and decaying wood, became crisper and more seasonal. The vast inland swamps that had defined the landscape for so long started to recede, leaving behind wide open plains and rugged, rocky interiors. In this changing world, life had to find a way to adapt to a landscape where water was no longer a constant companion. Imagine the edge of a slow-moving river where the ground is baked hard by a warm sun. Here, a quiet revolution was taking place. For millions of years, the ancestors of land animals had been tethered to the water. Like the frogs and toads we know today, they had to return to the shallows to lay their soft, jelly-like eggs. But now, nature invented something remarkable, the amniotic egg. Think of the amniotic egg as a tiny, self-contained pond, wrapped in a protective, leathery shell. Inside, the developing embryo was cushioned by its own private supply of water and nutrients. This shell allowed the egg to breathe while preventing the precious moisture inside from evaporating into the dry air. It was a portable cradle, a masterpiece of biological engineering that finally allowed life to break its last chains to the water's edge. Animals no longer had to live within walking distance of a swamp. They were free to wander deep into the hearts of the continents, to explore the high plateaus and the vast, sun-drenched valleys. Take a slow, deep breath, feeling that sense of newfound freedom in space. In this drier, more open world, new giants began to emerge. Perhaps the most famous of these was the Dimetrodon. You might recognize it from old illustrations, a sturdy creature with a magnificent high sail rising from its back like a fan. While it looks like a dinosaur, Dimetrodon lived 40 million years before the first dinosaur ever walked the earth. In fact, it belonged to a group called the synapsids. Despite its reptilian appearance, it was actually more closely related to us, the mammals, than it was to a T-Rex. That great sail on its back may have acted like a solar panel, helping the animal warm up in the morning sun or cool down in the breeze, a clever way to manage its energy in a world of shifting temperatures. The Permian was a time of hardy pioneers. The landscape was no longer dominated by giant, spore-bearing ferns, but by the first true conifers, trees with needles and cones that could withstand the drier air. Life was becoming more resilient, more independent, and more diverse. The interior of the world was no longer a silent wasteland. It was a bustling theater of life, where the first ancestors of the great mammals began their long, slow journey. As these creatures wandered further across the land itself was undergoing a massive transformation. The separate continents that had drifted apart for so long were now being drawn together by the slow, inexorable currents of the mantle. The jigsaw pieces of the earth were beginning to lock into place, merging into a single, colossal landmass that would come to the end of this era. The world was preparing to become one. Imagine, for a moment, a world where the map of the earth is unrecognizable. All the continents we know today, the Americas, Eurasia, Africa, Antarctica, and Australia, have drifted toward one another, drawn by the slow, deep currents of the mantle, until they finally meet in a colossal, slow-motion embrace. This is Pangaea. The name itself means all earth, and for a long stretch of time it was the only land there was. Close your eyes and picture this vast, singular continent. It was a world where a creature could start its journey at the icy South Pole and walk all the way to the North Pole without ever having to cross an ocean. It was a time of immense, unbroken horizons and a sense of unity that the earth hasn't seen since. Because the land was gathered into one massive block, the rest of the planet was covered by a single gargantuan ocean called Panthalassa. Imagine a blue world so wide that it stretched halfway around the globe, its waves rolling for thousands of miles without ever hitting a shore, a silent, rhythmic pulse of water that dominated the planet. Pangaea itself, which fully formed about 335 million years ago, was shaped roughly like a giant letter C. Tucked into the curve of that C was a smaller, warmer body of water known as the Tethys Sea. It was a tropical cradle of life, filled with ancient coral reefs and shimmering shoals, protected from the wilder, open waters of the Panthalassic Ocean. But as you move away from the coast and travel deep into the heart of Pangaea, the world changes. Because the continent was so vast, the moisture-rich clouds from the sea often ran out of rain long before they reached the center. This created a massive, silent desert at the heart of the world, a place of red plains and endless dunes where the sun baked the earth under a cloudless sky. It was a landscape of profound solitude where life had to be incredibly hardy to survive the dry heat of the day and the deep chill of the desert night. There is a strange, quiet peace in thinking about a unified world, a world where there were no separate islands, no distant shores, just one great landmass cradled by one great ocean. It was the ultimate stage for life's next chapter, a singular home for every living thing on the planet. However, as the Permian period drew to a close, this era of stability began to falter. The Earth was about to undergo its most profound challenge yet, a great dying that would reset the clock of life. This massive extinction event, though occurring over thousands of years, would clear the path for a new group of survivors. The world of the Permian was fading into the geological record, and in the quiet, dusty aftermath, the first shadows of the dinosaurs would begin to stir, ready to claim a world that was about to change once again. Take a slow, deep breath and let the image of that vast, quiet continent drift in your mind as we move toward the dawn of a new age. As the dust of the great dying settles, we find ourselves at the dawn of the Triassic period, a time of quiet recovery and a slow, steady pulse of renewal. The world feels a bit emptier at first. The vast landscapes of Pangaea, hushed after the immense loss of the Permian extinction. But in that emptiness, there is room for something entirely new to grow. Life is finding a new rhythm, a different way of moving through the world. If you were to stand on a sun-drenched ridge during this era, about 230 million years ago, you wouldn't see the towering giants of legend just yet. Instead, you would see the ancestors of greatness, small and sleek, darting through the ferns. Among these early pioneers were the first dinosaurs. They weren't the heavy, rumbling creatures we often imagine. They were light and agile. Imagine a creature like Colophysis, slender, bipedal, and no larger than a tall dog. It moved with a grace that was new to the world, its hollow bones making it light on its feet as it navigated the riverbanks of ancient North America. These early dinosaurs lived in the shadows of the larger, more established reptiles that had survived the extinction, waiting for their moment to step into the light. There is something deeply peaceful about imagining these small, elegant creatures exploring a world that was still rebuilding itself, unaware that their descendants would one day rule the entire planet. But the Triassic was not just the beginning for the dinosaurs. While these reptiles were claiming the daylight, another small, quiet miracle was taking place in the undergrowth. During this same period, the very first mammals began to appear. They were tiny, often no bigger than a modern shrew or a mouse, with soft fur and large, watchful eyes. They lived in the quiet corners of the world, perhaps coming out only at night when the larger predators were asleep. It is a humbling thought to realize that while the dinosaurs were beginning their rise to power, our own ancestors were already there, tucked away in the safety of the shadows, whispering the beginning of a story that would eventually lead to us. This era serves as a gentle reminder of the Earth's incredible resilience. No matter how great the upheaval, life always finds a way to return, to adapt, and to flourish in new and unexpected forms. The Triassic was a period of experimentation, a time when the blueprint for the modern world was being drafted in the quiet heat of a unified continent. But even as these new forms of life were finding their footing, the ground beneath them was beginning to stir. The great supercontinent of Pangaea, which had seemed so permanent and solid, was starting to feel the first tremors of a great division. Deep beneath the crust, the Earth's internal heat was pushing upward, creating massive rift valleys and internal pressure. The All-Earth was beginning to crack, and as the continent slowly started to drift apart, the world was preparing to transition into a warmer, wetter, and much larger chapter. The stage was being set for the giants to emerge as the quiet recovery of the Triassic gave way to the lush, towering forests of the Jurassic. Take a slow, steady breath as we watch the cracks in the earth begin to widen, signaling the start of the Age of Giants. As the Triassic fades into the distance, we find ourselves stepping into the Jurassic, the true golden age of the sauropods. If the Triassic was a time of recovery and experimentation, the Jurassic is a time of grand, sweeping confidence. The air is thick and velvet warm, carrying the moisture of a planet that has forgotten what it means to be cold. There are no ice caps at the poles during this era. Instead, lush forests of ferns, cycads, and towering conifers stretch across the land, creating a verdant carpet that feeds the largest animals to ever walk the earth. Imagine standing in a quiet clearing within one of these ancient forests. The ground beneath your feet is soft with fallen needles and moss. You might hear a low, rhythmic thrumming vibrating through the earth, not a sudden jolt, but a slow, heavy pulse. This is the footfall of a giant. Emerging from the mist is the Brachiosaurus, a creature so immense it defies the imagination. It moves with a slow, unhurried grace, its long neck reaching high into the upper reaches of the canopy where the sunlight filters through the leaves. To look this creature in the eye, you would have to look up toward the top of a 4-story building. It is a living mountain, a testament to what life can achieve when the world is warm, stable, and abundant. These sauropods were the gentle giants of their time. Their size was their primary defense, a physical manifestation of the Earth's generosity. They lived in a world where food was plentiful and the seasons were mild, allowing them to grow throughout their long lives. It is peaceful to think of these massive beings moving through the landscape, their shadows stretching across the forest floor as they graze on the highest branches, untouched by the smaller dramas of the world below. But while the giants claimed the earth, the sky was beginning to witness its own revolution. In the branches of the ancient ginkgo trees, a small feathered creature prepares to take flight. This is Archaeopteryx, a name that means ancient wing. It is a beautiful contradiction of a creature, part reptile with its long, bony tail and tiny teeth, and part bird with its delicate, asymmetrical feathers. As it glides from branch to branch, it marks the moment when life first began to master the air in a new way. These were the first whispers of the birds we see today, a bridge between the heavy, grounded world of the dinosaurs and the weightless freedom of the sky. The Jurassic was a period of incredible biological harmony. The oceans were filled with sleek ichthyosaurs and long-necked plesiosaurs, while the land was a sanctuary for life that had found its perfect rhythm. There is a profound sense of wonder in this era, a time when the planet seemed to hold its breath in a long, sun-drenched afternoon that lasted for millions of years. Everything was in balance, from the smallest insect to the largest sauropod, all playing their part in a grand, slow-moving symphony of existence. Yet, even in this golden age, the physical map of our world was quietly being rewritten. The great unified mass of Pangaea was no longer one. The deep rifts that had begun to form were widening, and the sea was beginning to creep into the spaces between the breaking continents. If we were to look down from high above, we would see the shapes of our modern world beginning to emerge. The gap between what would become North America and Africa was growing, preparing to invite the waters of a new, mighty ocean. The geography of the earth was shifting from a single story into a collection of different chapters. As the birth of the Atlantic Ocean began to change the face of the planet forever. As the Jurassic era progressed, the great unified land of Pangaea began to feel the immense pressure of the Earth's inner heat. Deep below the crust, the mantle was churning, driven by the slow decay of radioactive elements and the lingering warmth of the planet's formation. This internal engine, silent and invisible, began to push upward against the solid rock of the surface. Imagine a slow-motion stretching of a vast, ancient tapestry. This was the birth of the Atlantic Ocean, a process that started not with a wave, but with a rift. In the regions we now know as the east coast of North America and the west coast of Africa, the ground began to pull apart. Great valleys formed, their floors dropping as the crust was thinned and tugged in opposite directions. For millions of years, these were dry, jagged landscapes, perhaps filled with deep lakes and the occasional glow of volcanic activity. But eventually, the rift grew wide enough and deep enough for the surrounding seas to find a way in. A trickle of salt water became a stream, then a flood, and finally a narrow, shallow sea. This was the infancy of the Atlantic, a blue ribbon of water winding through the red rocks of the breaking continent. As North America and Africa continued their slow departure from one another, the seafloor itself began to grow. At the center of this new ocean, a remarkable geological feature was taking shape: the mid-Atlantic ridge. If you could drain the water away today, you would see a mountain range more magnificent and longer than any on land. Stretching for over 10,000 miles from the Arctic to the Southern Ocean, it is the longest mountain chain on the planet. It is a volcanic spine, a place where magma from deep within the mantle rises to the surface, cools in the frigid water, and hardens into brand new crust. It is comforting to think that even now, as you rest, the Earth is still making itself. The mid-Atlantic ridge is still active, pushing the continents apart by about an inch or two every year, roughly the same speed at which your fingernails grow. This slow, steady heartbeat of the planet has been drumming for nearly 200 million years, steadily widening the gap between the old world and the new. This is the ultimate architect of our modern map, a geography carved not by wind or rain, but by the profound heat of the Earth's core. This great division had a beautiful unintended consequence for the history of life. As the continents drifted further apart, they became isolated islands on a global scale. The creatures living on these separate land masses were no longer able to mingle or compete across a single unified territory. Instead, they were left to evolve in their own unique directions, turning each continent into a vast, open-air, evolutionary laboratory. The plants and animals of the coming ages would begin to take on distinct forms, adapting to their specific climates and neighbors in ways that would never have been possible on a single supercontinent. The world was no longer a single story. It was becoming an anthology of diverse environments, each preparing to host its own cast of remarkable characters. As the Atlantic widened and the climate continued to shift, the stage was set for a new era, a time when the green world would find its voice in a burst of color and fragrance, and the most famous giants of all would take their place in the sun. As the continents continued their slow, graceful drift, we enter the Cretaceous period, perhaps the most famous chapter in the history of our planet. This was a time of true transition, where the ancient alien landscapes of the past began to soften into something more familiar. If you could travel back to this era, you might find yourself standing in a forest that felt remarkably like home. For hundreds of millions of years, the world had been a palette of deep greens and earthy browns. The forests were dominated by ferns, cycads, and towering conifers, plants that reproduced through spores or heavy cones. It was a silent, sturdy world. But during the Cretaceous, a gentle revolution began to unfold on the forest floor. This was the era when the first flowers, the angiosperms, began to bloom. Imagine the air of a Cretaceous morning. For the first time in Earth's long history, the breeze carried a faint, sweet perfume. The landscape was no longer just a sea of green. It was being painted with splashes of white, yellow, and soft pink. These early flowers were modest at first, simple blossoms like magnolias and lilies, but they changed the world forever. They brought color, they brought scent, and they brought a new rhythm to life. With the arrival of flowers came their most devoted partners. This period saw the rise of the first bees and butterflies. It was the beginning of a silent, beautiful pact between plants and insects, a dance of pollination that allowed life to spread and diversify with incredible speed. As you breathe in slowly, imagine the soft hum of those ancient insects moving through a sun-dappled glade, a sound that has echoed through the ages into our own gardens today. This was also the golden age of the most iconic creatures to ever walk the earth. In the lush floodplains and dense forests, the Tyrannosaurus rex and the Triceratops made their home. It is a common misconception that all dinosaurs lived together in a single, unchanging era, but the truth is much more profound. There is a staggering stretch of time between the different ages of these giants. In fact, the Tyrannosaurus rex lived much closer in time to us, sitting here in the present day, than it did to the Stegosaurus. The gap between the plated Stegosaurus of the Jurassic and the fierce T-Rex of the Cretaceous was over 80 million years, a span of time so vast it is hard for the human mind to fully grasp. Despite their fearsome reputations, these creatures lived in a world that was becoming increasingly delicate and beautiful. The climate remained warm and the seas were high, creating shallow, sun-drenched waterways that teemed with the life. The world was beginning to look and even smell like the nature we recognize. You might have seen ancestors of the oak tree or the maple, their leaves whispering in the same wind that cooled the skin of a resting dinosaur. It is a comforting thought that the roots of our modern world are buried so deep in this prehistoric soil. The flowers that sit on a windowsill today are the direct descendants of those first Cretaceous blossoms that dared to add color to a green world. While many of the stories of this era are told through bones and footprints turned to cold, heavy stone, some moments were captured in a much more intimate, high-definition way. High above the forest floor, in the canopy of ancient conifers, a golden liquid was slowly weeping from the bark. This sticky resin was a trap for the small and the delicate, waiting to preserve the tiniest details of a Cretaceous afternoon for millions of years to come. Imagine a warm, humid afternoon in a Cretaceous forest. The sun filters through the canopy of towering conifers, casting dappled light onto the mossy ground. From the bark of these ancient trees, a thick golden liquid begins to weep. This is not sap, which carries nutrients, but resin, a sticky, fragrant defense the tree uses to heal its wounds and ward off bark-eating beetles. As it flows slowly down the trunk, it captures everything in its path. This is the birth of amber, nature's most exquisite and intimate time capsule. Unlike the heavy, stony fossils of the floodplains, amber offers us a look at the past in breathtaking high definition. It is a fossil made of light and clarity. As you settle deeper into your pillow, imagine a tiny gnat, its iridescent wings still spread as if it were just about to take flight. Or perhaps a prehistoric ant, frozen mid-stride as it scavenged for food. Within these golden drops, time doesn't just slow down, it stops entirely. We are looking at a single, quiet second of life that occurred nearly 100 million years ago, rendered in perfect detail. In recent years, the secrets held within amber have become even more wondrous. Scientists have discovered more than just insects. They have found the delicate downy feathers of small bird-like dinosaurs still showing the fine structures that allowed them to stay warm or perhaps even glide through the humid air. They have found tiny lizard tails with the scales still intact, and even the minute prehistoric flowers that we spoke of earlier, their petals perfectly preserved as if they had just fallen from the branch. In some rare pieces, we can even see bubbles of air from the Cretaceous period, trapped forever, a breath of the ancient world held in a golden lung. There is a common wonder about whether these golden gems could hold the blueprint for life itself. It is true that amber can preserve fragments of DNA, the chemical code of life, far better than bone or stone. However, time is a persistent traveler, and over millions of years, those fragile strands of information naturally break apart. We find the whispers of a code, enough to tell us about the relationships between species. But the complete instruction manual for a dinosaur remains a mystery, safely tucked away in the deep silence of the past. The transformation from sticky resin to hard, gem-like amber is a slow and patient process. It requires millions of years of burial, where heat and pressure cause the organic molecules to link together in a process called polymerization. It is as if the earth itself is carefully curing these moments turning a liquid tear into a permanent jewel. To hold a piece of amber is to hold a prehistoric afternoon in the palm of your hand, a moment of warmth and life that has survived the rise and fall of countless empires. As we gaze through these golden windows, we see a world of immense peace and intricate detail. It is a world where the small things, a feather, a leaf, a bubble of ancient air, matter just as much as the giants that shook the ground. But even as these tiny lives were being preserved in gold, the grand era they belonged to was drawing toward a close. The long, warm summer of the dinosaurs, which had lasted for so many millions of years, was approaching a sudden and dramatic turning point. The atmosphere was calm, the forests were lush, and the golden resin continued to fall, unaware that the world was about to change in an instant. The transition from the golden age of the dinosaurs to the Cenozoic era is one of the most profound chapters in the story of our planet. It is a story of resilience, of how the small, the patient, and the hidden inherited a transformed world. For over 100 million years, the giants had ruled the land, the sea, and the sky. But about 66 million years ago, a singular event changed the course of life forever. A massive asteroid, roughly 6 miles wide, struck the Earth at what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The impact was a moment of immense transformation. Yet, in the long memory of the Earth, it led to a period of deep, heavy silence. As the dust and soot settled into the atmosphere, the sunlight was softened and dimmed for several years. The world became cooler and quieter, while the great dinosaurs, who required vast amounts of food and stable temperatures, could not sustain themselves in this shifting environment. Life did not disappear. It simply moved underground. Imagine the world during this time, a quiet, shadowy landscape where the wind moved through empty forests. Beneath the surface, in cool earthen burrows, our distant ancestors were waiting. These early mammals were small, often no larger than a shrew or a squirrel. They were humble creatures, but they possessed a remarkable advantage. They were versatile. They could eat insects, seeds, and roots, and their underground homes shielded them from the changing climate above. In the safety of the dark soil, they slept and waited, their small hearts beating a steady rhythm of survival. As the skies eventually began to clear, the first sign of the world's recovery was a soft green wave. Geologists see this in the fossil record as the fern spike. Ferns are nature's pioneers. They are often the first plants to grow back after a forest fire or a volcanic eruption. For a time, the earth was covered in a lush, low carpet of green fronds, unfurling slowly in the returning sunlight. These ferns stabilized the soil and prepared the way for the return of the flowering plants and the great forests. With the giants gone, a vast empty stage was left for the survivors. This was the dawn of the Cenozoic era, a name that means new life. Out of the quiet, a new lineage began to flourish with incredible speed. Without the pressure of giant predators, mammals began to grow larger and more diverse. Some stayed in the forests, some ventured out into the vast new grasslands, and some even returned to the cooling oceans. It was a time of creative experimentation, where the blueprints for the animals we know today, the elephants, the horses, and the primates, began to take their first ancestral shapes. While life was busily reinventing itself on the surface, the Earth's crust continued its slow, rhythmic dance. The continents were no longer huddled together, they were drifting apart, carving out the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. But as they moved, they also began to collide. The immense heat of the Earth's core provided the energy for a slow-motion crash of continental plates. These collisions were beginning to buckle the Earth, pushing the ancient seafloors upward toward the sky to create the great mountain ranges that now crown our world. The map of the Earth was becoming familiar, and the stage was being set for a collision that would raise the highest peaks on the planet. Take a deep, slow breath and imagine the Earth's map as it was 40 million years ago. One of the most incredible transformations in our planet's history was just beginning. At that time, India was not yet part of the Asian continent. It was a vast, wandering island, drifting steadily northward across the ancient Tethys Ocean. Driven by the immense quiet heat of the Earth's mantle, this landmass moved with a slow, patient inevitability. As India approached the southern edge of Asia, the ocean that lay between them began to narrow. This wasn't a crash in the way we usually think of one. It was a collision that unfolded over millions of years. A slow-motion folding of the Earth's crust. Imagine two soft, heavy blankets being pushed toward one another on a smooth floor. Where they meet, they have nowhere to go but up, rippling and buckling into magnificent folds. This is how the Himalayas were born. What makes this story so beautiful is what those mountains are actually made of. As the two land masses squeezed together, they trapped the ancient seafloor between them. The mud, the sand, and the remains of countless marine creatures were lifted from the dark depths of the ocean and pushed toward the sky. Because of this, if you were to climb to the very top of Mount Everest today, you would find something extraordinary. There, in the freezing air of the world's highest peaks, are the fossilized remains of seashells. Specifically, geologists find the coiled, spiral fossils of ammonites, creatures that once swam in warm, shallow waters millions of years ago. It is a quiet, humbling thought to realize that the highest point on our planet was once a silent seabed, teeming with life beneath the waves. The Earth has the power to turn the bottom of the ocean into a crown of ice and stone, shifting the very geography of life. Even now, this great work is not finished. The collision between India and Asia continues to this day. The mountains are still growing, rising by about 1 centimeter every year, a pace so slow it is almost imperceptible, roughly the same speed at which your fingernails grow. It is a reminder that the ground beneath us is never truly still. It is always in a state of gentle, patient becoming, even when it appears as solid as granite. As these massive peaks rose higher and higher into the atmosphere, they began to influence the very air of the planet. They acted as a great wall, redirecting the winds and altering the flow of moisture across the continents. These changes, combined with shifts in the Earth's orbit and the arrangement of the oceans, began to nudge the world toward a new chapter. The warmth of the previous eras began to fade, replaced by a steady creeping chill. The lush greens of the world were about to be dusted with white, as the Earth prepared for its most recent big freeze. A time of crystalline beauty and great silent ice sheets that would once again reshape the life of the land. The cooling that began with the rising of the mountains eventually led the world into a deep rhythmic slumber known as the Pleistocene. This was the time of the great ice ages, a period of nearly 2.5 million years, where the earth pulsed between frozen stillness and brief moments of warmth. It was a world that belonged to the giants, the woolly mammoth, with tusks like curved ivory arches and coats of thick, shaggy fur, and the saber-toothed cat moving with silent grace through the tall, frosted grasses of the steppes. In this hushed, wintry world, the very air felt different, crisp, thin, and filled with the scent of pine and frozen earth. Try to imagine the sheer, quiet power of the ice. These were not just thin layers of seasonal snow, but massive sheets of glacial ice, sometimes 2 or 3 miles thick, resting heavily upon the continents. They moved with a patient, crushing force, behaving like a very slow river of glass. As these glaciers advanced, they acted as nature's most powerful sculptors. They ground down the jagged edges of mountains and carved deep rhythmic grooves into the bedrock beneath them. When you look at the Great Lakes of North America today, or the narrow, towering fjords of the Scandinavian coast, you're looking at the fingerprints of the ice. The glaciers scooped out the earth with their immense weight and, as they eventually melted, left behind these vast, deep basins of clear, cold water. At the very peak of the last glacial maximum, the world looked vastly different than it does tonight. Nearly 30% of the Earth's land surface was buried under a shimmering white mantle. Because so much of the planet's water was frozen into these towering continental glaciers, there was much less water left to fill the basins of the sea. The oceans receded, and sea levels fell by a staggering 120 meters, nearly 400 feet lower than they are now. This retreat of the tale revealed hidden worlds, vast plains of land that had been submerged for eons. It created land bridges, like the wide stretch of tundra that once connected Siberia to Alaska, allowing life to wander across the globe, crossing between continents that are now separated by deep blue stretches of ocean. It was a world of stark crystalline beauty. If you could have stood on a high ridge back then, you would have seen a horizon of brilliant whites and deep translucent blues illuminated by a sun that felt distant but bright. The air was incredibly still, broken only by the occasional groan, shifting ice, or the distant call of a wandering herd. Life did not just survive here. It found a way to flourish in the cold. Creatures grew larger, their bodies designed to hold on to every bit of warmth, moving through a landscape that must have felt eternal and unchanging. Yet, even the most profound winter is part of a larger, celestial cycle. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the Earth's relationship with the sun began to shift once more. The great sheets of ice, which had seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves, began to soften. They retreated toward the high north and the deep south, pouring their ancient meltwater back into the rising oceans. This retreat signaled the end of the Great Freeze and the beginning of a long, stable summer for our planet. The world was warming, the soil was softening, and a rare window of climatic peace was about to open, a period of balance that would allow the story of life to take its most familiar and transformative turn. This warming, this gentle exhale of the planet brought us into the epoch we call the Holocene. If the Earth's long history is a vast and stormy year, the Holocene is like a brief, golden afternoon in late summer, a time of remarkable, almost miraculous stability. It began roughly 11,700 years ago, as the last of the great continental ice sheets pulled back toward the poles, leaving behind the world we recognize today. The air grew mild. The seasons began to follow a predictable, rhythmic pulse, and the wild, swinging temperatures of the Ice Age finally began to settle into a calm, steady hum. In the context of deep time, this period is just a heartbeat, a tiny sliver of a second on the geological clock. Yet, it is within this quiet window that everything we know about our own history took place. For millions of years, the climate had been a restless giant, shifting from frozen tundras to steaming jungles. But in the Holocene, the giant seemed to fall into a peaceful sleep. This stability was the key that unlocked a new way of living. As the weather became reliable, the first groups of people noticed that the seeds they gathered would return to the same patches of soil year after year, watered by the same gentle spring rains. Slowly, the wandering stopped. Agriculture began to take root in the fertile river valleys of the world. Because the climate was no longer a constant threat, life could settle. We began to build, not just temporary shelters, but villages, then cities, and eventually the vast interconnected world of today. The glaciers, in their retreat, had left behind rich, silty earth and deep reservoirs of fresh water, providing the perfect cradle for this new chapter of life to flourish. The rising seas finally reached their current heights, flooding the coastal plains and creating the familiar outlines of the continents as we see them on a map tonight. It is easy to feel that the world has always been this way, with its temperate forests, its steady tides, and its predictable harvests. But when we look back through the billions of years we have traveled tonight, we realize that the Holocene is a rare and precious gift. It is a narrow, hospitable bridge in time, a moment where the Earth's complex systems have reached a delicate, beautiful equilibrium. We are living in a pause between the great movements of the crust and the ice, a quiet clearing in a very long and ancient forest. As we rest in the stillness of our modern world, it is worth reflecting on the fact that we too are part of the Earth's geological record. Just as the trilobites left their delicate shells in the ancient mud, and the dinosaurs left their massive bones in the riverbeds, we are leaving our own mark upon the planet. Every road we pave, every city we raise, and every material we create is being slowly folded into the story of the ground beneath us. Even now, as the world turns quietly in the dark, the processes of sedimentation and pressure are beginning to preserve the evidence of our time here, preparing to tell our story to whoever might look at the rocks 1,000,000 years from now. We are currently creating the layers that will one day become the fossils of the future. If we were to travel forward, past the horizon of our own lives, and deep into the future, we might wonder what a geologist of that distant era would find when they dig into the Earth. The layers we are building today are unique in the history of the planet. Scientists sometimes refer to this as the technosphere, the physical remains of our civilization that are being slowly integrated into the crust. In the great slow crush of time, our towering skyscrapers and sprawling cities will not simply vanish. They will be compressed into thin, dark lines of mineral and glass. The concrete of our foundations, made from crushed limestone and sand, will return to a stony state, perhaps forming a new kind of artificial rock that future scientists might call urbanite. Even the vast networks of our subways and tunnels, carved deep into the bedrock, may one day be preserved as giant trace fossils, the hollowed-out burrows of a species that learned to navigate the subterranean world. One of the most curious artifacts of our time may be something called plasticlomerate. This is a term used to describe a new type of rock formed when plastic waste, perhaps melted by the heat of a campfire or volcanic activity, fuses together with sand, pebbles, and shells. These colorful jagged stones are already being found on beaches today, and because plastic is so incredibly durable, these fragments could survive for eons, tucked away in the sedimentary layers like the amber we spoke of earlier. They will be the bright, strange jewels of our era, telling a story of a world that learned to create materials that nature had never seen before. Beyond the physical objects, we are also leaving behind a subtle chemical signature. Just as the great oxidation event left a layer of rusted iron in the ancient rocks, our era is leaving behind a unique blend of isotopes and elements. The carbon from the fuels we have used, the nitrogen from our fields, and even the microscopic particles of rare metals from our electronics are all settling into the dust. To a future observer, this will appear as a distinct golden spike in the geological record, a thin, vibrant line that marks the brief, intense moment when humanity shaped the face of the earth. There is a profound comfort in this realization. It means that we are not separate from the earth's long history. We are deeply woven into it. We are part of the same grand unfolding narrative as the trilobites that scuttled across the Cambrian seafloor and the dinosaurs that left their footprints in the Mesozoic mud. Our time on Earth is not a detour from the natural world, but a continuation of its endless creativity. We are the latest chapter in a book that has been being written for 4.5 billion years. And like every chapter before us, we are leaving our mark in the quiet, enduring memory of the stone. As you lie here now, let that thought settle over you like a soft blanket. The bed beneath you, the walls around you, and the ground far below are all part of a world that is constantly, quietly recording its own journey. There is no need to rush, no need to worry about the vastness of time. You are held by a planet that remembers everything, a world that has seen countless dawns and will see countless more. The air you breathe is the same air that has cycled through forests and oceans for eons. And the stillness of the night is a reflection of the deep, patient peace that has always resided at the heart of the earth. Take a slow, deep breath and feel yourself sinking with that ancient rhythm, resting in the knowledge that you are right where you belong in the great story of deep time. The world is turning slowly, and for tonight, your part in the story is simply to rest. The long, slow breath of the earth continues even in the stillness of this very moment. As you lie there, drifting closer to the edge of sleep, the world beneath you is not static. It is a living, shifting masterpiece that never truly reaches a final state. The same heat that forged the first crust 4 billion years ago is still churning deep within the mantle, driving the slow, rhythmic dance of the continents. They are moving even now at the same imperceptible speed that your fingernails grow, a pace so patient that it belongs more to the stars than to the frantic world of clocks and calendars. In the far distant future, perhaps 250 million years from now, the map of our world will have transformed once again. Geologists look ahead and see the Atlantic Ocean slowly beginning to close, drawing the Americas back toward the ancient shores of Africa and Europe. Australia continues its steady journey northward, eventually merging with the islands of Southeast Asia. Scientists have a name for this future configuration, Pangaea Proxima, the next Pangaea. It is a beautiful cyclical thought that the land masses, which broke apart so long ago, will eventually find their way back to one another, gathering together into a single, unified cradle once more. There is a profound sense of peace in this permanence. It reminds us that change is not something to be feared, but is simply the way the earth breathes. The mountains will rise and eventually return to the sea as sand. The oceans will widen and then vanish to make way for new plains. Through all of this, the earth remains a stable, enduring home that has mastered the art of patience. You are a part of this rhythm. The same atoms that once resided in the heart of a prehistoric fern or within the shell of a trilobite are now part of you, resting here in the quiet of the night. You are made of the earth, and you are held by it, nestled within a history that is billions of years deep. As we reach the end of our journey through time, let the weight of these eons settle your mind. There is nothing left to do, nowhere left to go, and no more facts to remember. The story of the earth is a long one, and it will continue to unfold long after we have finished our rest. But for now, the world is quiet. The sun has set, the air is cool, and the planet is spinning slowly, steadily through the velvet dark of space. Feel the gentle pull of gravity, the Earth's own way of whispering that you are safe and exactly where you need to be. The great cycles of the cosmos are in motion. The continents are on their long walk home, and the stars are watching over the silent hemisphere. You are a passenger on a magnificent, ancient vessel, and it is time now to let go of the day. Take one last, slow breath, sinking your heart with the deep, steady pulse of the world. Allow your thoughts to dissolve into the soft shadows of the room. The journey is complete, the story is told, and the earth is at peace. Sleep now, deeply and restoratively, as the planet continues its long, beautiful dream. Good night.